Hello folks, and welcome to the latest video by 1960s and 70s Chronicles of a Golden Era. This one is going to be a quick run-through of my personal choice of top 10 albums of all time. The list is in no particular order, except for the first one, which has already featured in an album review all of its own, in a video called The Greatest Album Ever Released, in my opinion. And that album is this one, Genesis Nursery Crime. To keep it brief, I'll say simply, this is prog rock at its very best in every department. Next one. This was my introduction to heavy music as I was moving into my senior years at high school. I just passed my first serious exams at high school in Britain. Back in the day, those were called O-levels, ordinary levels. And my parents gave me the price of an album for every one that I passed. And the first album I bought was this one, Led Zeppelin 3. I was desperate to get into heavy, sophisticated sounds, the ones that the bands and artists, the albums that the more sophisticated, studenty type pupils at school were listening to. I saw that as a progress from the glam rock that I'd been used to. And this was my first introduction to that. It was not so easy to make the transition thanks to this album, because the first track is, of course, the Immigrant Song. Punchy, heavy riffs. It's a rock song. It's short and not a big leap from glam rock. The rest of the album took me a bit longer to get into, especially since I've Been Loving You, which is, of course, the jewel in the crown of this album. I think most people would agree. It's now my favourite track in the album and one of my favourite Zeppelin songs. And that's going to be a theme running throughout this video. A lot of the albums that I choose took a long time to get into and have lasted the course. They're now in my top 10. So that's number 2. Number 3 is this one, Jesus Christ Superstar movie soundtrack. And the movie soundtrack version was the first version that I heard, and so perhaps that's why it's my favourite. I've always been fascinated by religiosity and spirituality ever since I was a kid in primary school. Although I've never belonged to a religion, I did not have religious parents, and my school paid very little attention to religion. Token gestures of prayer and so on in primary school. High school, almost nothing. But my fascination for it was a very natural thing. And I was lucky because the music that we grew up with was suffused with religious and spiritual and philosophical references that encouraged inquiry and debate and discussion. And it just helped to fuel and stimulate this natural interest that I had anyway. Jesus Christ Superstar is totally fascinating because it is not a religious telling of the story. It is not a preaching or evangelical telling of the story. It's a very human telling of the story. And that struck me completely. There are no miracles from the Bible mentioned in this. It's an entirely human story about one particular individual and the people around him involved in a particular situation that was very unusual in a particular time and setting. But like I say, told in an entirely human way, discussing human emotions and reactions and pragmatic decision-making. And ultimately, a decision-making by the central character, of course, Jesus, that was not pragmatic. It was the ultimate expression of altruism, kindness and bravery. And that stimulated my interest even more, not just in Christianity, but in all spirituality, and the nature of spirituality as an emotional and other than physical sensation and phenomenon, and something that has to be explored in deep, deep levels. And this album, especially the lyricism in this album, but also the music that complements it, was a great stimulation to me in that spiritual search, which for me is still going on. Next album won't come as any surprise to anybody who follows the Chronicles Facebook page. It's this one, Cat Stevens' Teaser and the Fire Cat. Keeping this brief, essentially folk rock. Again, wonderful lyricism, and this is another album which is emotional. No matter your emotional state, whether you're low or feeling good or joyous, this album will raise your emotions to a higher level. If you're feeling down, you'll feel better by listening to this album, or you will feel as though you can better understand the emotions that you're going through and understand that they are very, again, human emotions that are shared by everyone. There's great empathy for the human condition that comes through in the tracks of this album. So, Teaser and the Fire Cat. Next one, I don't have the album cover for on the CD, so I'm going to hold this up close. And it is, you'll see, yes, going for the one. I wasn't a great Yes fan until this album was released. They also released the single Wondrous Stories from this album, and that kind of hooked me. I love the single. So I thought I'm going to give this band a real good try. So I bought the album, and again, it's another album that took a long time to get into all of the tracks. Apart from Wondrous Stories, and of course the title track, Going for the One, which is a big, heavy riffing opening and gallops along. It's a good rocky pace. The other tracks in the album took longer to get into. They were more like the heavier prog rock, yes, but the lyrics were much more accessible than in previous Yes albums. And steady listening and persistence, I got into each track slowly, and now it's one of my top 10 albums of all time. Next one, TRex, the album TRex, the first album from the time when Tyrannosaurus Rex became T-Rex. But this was an album that was released before T-Rex went glam rock. So this is on the cusp between the folk rock Tyrannosaurus Rex and the more electrified glam rock of T-Rex. This has a mix of both, and a fantastic mix of both. There's great, soft, acoustic folk rock songs on here, but there are also great electric moments, great guitar solos and riffing. It is a great blend of folk rock Tyrannosaurus Rex and glam rock T-Rex. And the highlight for me always on Mark Bolan albums is the abstract lyricism. I refer to Bolan as a lyrical Salvador Dali because the lyrics are so abstract and invite the listener to construct his or her own imagery from listening to the songs. And what can I say other than this is one of my top 10 albums of all time. I thoroughly recommend it. Next one, Bob Dylan's Desire. Now, again, I wasn't a great Bob Dylan fan until this was released. I respected and appreciated his work and liked the famous tracks from the 60s, of course, and the Process songs. But here's the story. I went into a small record shop in Glasgow where I lived, and they were playing Hurricane. And I just didn't leave the shop. I just totally mesmerized by this track, Hurricane. And it was just one of those moments. You hear a particular track and it is so captivating that I thought I'm buying the album. And I did buy the album. And again, It took me time, slowly, to get into every track, but once I did, it put Desire into my list of top 10 albums, and it's been there ever since. Next one. George Harrison fan. This should not surprise people on Chronicles again. Living in the Material World. Again, this was an album that deeply and greatly influenced my spiritual search, which, as I said earlier, is something I'd always been fascinated by ever since I was a small kid. Now, this album is rich with spiritual references, particularly towards Krishna, of course. Krishna was George Harrison's great spiritual direction and inspiration. And the references in the album to living in the material world, I mean, what other kind of world was there? I thought at the time, then you find out more and you discover more about spirituality, generally speaking, and I was stimulated even more to discover the depths of religiosity and spirituality, and the human, again, side of this album, the emotional side, was also a great inspiration to me, especially in my teens, when you're going through that kind of phase in life, and helps you to deal with understanding human emotions. Living in the Material World, one of my top 10 albums of all time. Now, the next two albums are albums that I do not have the CDs for, or couldn't find them anyway as I was digging through the archives. So I had to print off pictures of the album cover. The first one is this one. It is, you can see that, I hope, the Electric Light Orchestra El Dorado. El Dorado was a combination of the ELO experiment, which was set up by Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood when they were in the Move to explore the direction that they thought that the Beatles' music would have taken if the Beatles had stayed together. So they went down the avenue of using classical rock music fusion because of the experiments that the Beatles had been involved in using classical instruments. And the first three ELO albums were all different from each other as they explored this experiment and where things might go. But all culminated in El Dorado, a 100-piece symphony orchestra and a prog rock concept. And it is absolutely magnificent. El Dorado, the Electric Light Orchestra. Final album in my top 10, although not 10th, after number one, like I say, the rest are no particular order, is this one. Ever since the Chronicles Facebook page started, really, I've been trying to promote this album because it's so underrated and overlooked. This album is, and I cannot recommend it highly enough, it is Sally Oldfield, Water Bearer. Sally Oldfield is Mike Oldfield's sister. Together they were in a folk rock band called the Sally Angie. Mike became a megastar, of course. Sally had a successful solo career, but this album, Water Bearer, which features the single Mirrors, is absolutely superb. It is a wonderful example of prog rock. The first side is dedicated to the work of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Middle-earth mythology. And it features Sally Oldfield's rangy vocals, which can reach the highest notes, the lowest notes, everything in between. And there's some counterpoint with a trained classical baritone opera singer within this, the first side of the vinyl, obviously, the first side of the album, which is Songs of the Quendi, dedicated to the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, Middle-earth. The second side of the album, the vinyl album, of course, similar prog rock folk rock, prog rock blending. Sally Oldfield's fabulous vocal range. The lyrics are wonderful. Everything about this album I thoroughly recommend. No weak tracks, absolute gem of an album. Please give it a listen. Let's get this album the recognition that it deserves. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Quick run through of my top 10 albums of all time, and I'd like to know what yours are too. Right now, I'm going to do the YouTube thing and say, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, and please leave comments on the YouTube presentation and also when I post this to the Chronicles Facebook page. And I'll finish off as usual by saying thank you very much for watching and listening, and take care.